The brass bookend slammed into the guard's knee with a sickening crack. I snatched his keycard as he went down, my only way into the study. The diary was there, and if I didn't get it now, my mother's secrets would vanish forever. The smoke detector's lens glared at me, its red light pulsing like a heartbeat. Not security, not the house. The feed was routing straight to my therapist's office. Every session, every tear, all of it a lie. And now, they knew I was coming. Gravel crunched under the tires of Sarah's sedan, the sound unnervingly loud in the heavy silence of the Greenwich estate. She killed the engine, but her hands remained fused to the steering wheel, her knuckles white against the dark leather. The air in the car felt thin, filtered through the vents of a machine that was the last thing she truly owned. Outside, the world was a study in aggressive perfection. The lawns were a deep emerald green, trimmed so precisely they looked like carpet, and the hedges stood like frozen soldiers along the perimeter. Jim Taylor stood by the stone fountain, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. He didn't offer his usual warm grin. Instead, he toyed with a loose thread on his cuff, his eyes darting toward the perimeter. Sarah pushed the door open, and the scent of blooming jasmine, once a comfort, now curdled in the humid air. It was too sweet, like a funeral parlor trying to mask the smell of decay. Brenda let them go this morning, Jim whispered as Sarah approached. His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the splashing water of the fountain. Every single one, even Mrs. Higgins, said the house needed a fresher perspective. Sarah's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She looked past Jim toward the manor, where the elderly groundskeeper used to prune the hydrangeas. 3 men in tactical vests now paced. They weren't gardeners. They moved with a synchronized predatory grace, their boots thudding against the manicured turf with a heavy, industrial finality. One guard paused, his hand resting on a holstered sidearm, and tracked Sarah with a cold, metallic stare that made the hair on her arms stand up. "She's stripping the place, Jim," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "She's erasing my mother." "It's more than that, Sarah," Jim replied, his voice dropping an octave. He began to walk toward a patch of mulch, his gait heavy. He started counting under his breath. 1, 2, 3. A habit he'd picked up years ago to keep his footing in a world that felt increasingly unstable. She's brought in her own people. They don't know the soil. They only know the walls. Be careful. They aren't here to open doors for you. Sarah marched toward the heavy oak entrance, her boots clicking against the stone path. The familiar warmth of the manor had evaporated. In its place stood a fortress of glass and limestone, reclaimed by Brenda's iron will. Brenda hadn't just changed the locks. She had replaced the atmosphere itself. The air felt pressurized, heavy with the weight of secrets and the cold hum of new, invisible machinery. As she crossed the threshold, the silence of the house bit at her. The grand foyer, usually filled with the scent of beeswax and lemon, now smelled of industrial bleach. It was a sharp, stinging scent that burned the back of her throat. She headed straight for the stairs, her mind fixed on one goal: the study. She needed her mother's leather-bound diary. It was the only thing left that contained the truth of those final days, the frantic scribbles of a woman who knew the red phobia wasn't just a quirk, but a symptom of a life spent in terror. She reached the heavy mahogany doors of the study and pushed. They swung open with a groan of protest. The room was a tomb of dark wood and velvet curtains that swallowed the afternoon light. Sarah moved toward the desk, her fingers itching to touch the hidden compartment in the lower drawer. "Can I help you, Miss Miller?" The voice was like a slab of cold marble. Sarah spun around. Standing in the doorway was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. His suit was too tight across his massive shoulders, and he held a heavy flashlight in his hand, tapping it against his thigh in a rhythmic, 4-beat pattern. Thud, 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 thud. "I'm here for my personal property," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the roar of blood in her ears. "This is my father's house. I don't need permission to be here." The guard, whose name tag read Harris, didn't move. He didn't even look her in the eye. He stared at a point just past her left ear. Mrs. Miller gave strict instructions. "No one enters the study without her supervision. I'll have to ask you to leave." "I'm not leaving without that book," Sarah snapped. She lunged for the desk drawer, her fingers catching the brass handle. In a blur of motion, Harris was on her. He didn't use his hands at first. He used his bulk to pin her against the heavy oak desk. The smell of his cologne, something sharp and synthetic, filled her lungs. Sarah struggled, her heels skidding on the polished floor. Cold metal bit into her hip as she was pressed against the desk's edge. "Let go of me," she hissed. Harris gripped her upper arms, his fingers like iron bands. "I told you to leave, Miss Miller. Don't make this difficult." The physical violation sparked a white-hot flare of rage in Sarah's chest. She wasn't the unstable girl they had tried to break years ago. She was a witness. She reached out blindly, her hand sweeping across the desktop until her fingers closed around a heavy brass bookend. A stylized owl that her mother had used to hold up her collection of poetry. With a grunt of effort, Sarah swung the brass weight down. It connected with Harris's kneecap with a sickening crack. The guard let out a choked cry, and his grip slackened as his leg buckled. Sarah didn't wait. As he stumbled back, his heavy duty belt snagged on the corner of the chair, and a plastic card slid out of a leather pouch, fluttering to the rug like a falling leaf. Sarah dove for it. Her fingers brushed the cold plastic, a digital keycard with a gold-embossed M on the front. She shoved it into her pocket, the rhythmic clicking of her own voice recorder in her other pocket providing a frantic beat to her escape. She scrambled past the groaning guard and bolted into the hallway, slamming the heavy study door and turning the ancient brass key she'd swiped from the sideboard. The lock clicked home with a finality that made her chest heave. She was out, and for the first time, she had a piece of their armor. She retreated to her old bedroom, locking the door and leaning against it until her breathing slowed. The house felt like it was watching her. She pulled out her laptop, her fingers trembling as she set it on the duvet. She needed to know what that keycard opened. But more importantly, she needed to know why the air felt so thick with surveillance. She pulled a small handheld device from her bag, a signal finder she'd bought after her mother's funeral. She swept it across the room. Near the ceiling, the smoke detector emitted a faint, high-pitched whine that the human ear usually ignored. Sarah stood on a chair, her heart hammering. She pried the plastic cover off. Tucked inside the wiring was a lens no larger than a pinhead. It wasn't part of the estate's standard security. This was professional-grade, surgical-level spying. Subverted. Sarah felt a surge of cold competence. She knew how to handle this. She wasn't just a victim, she was a researcher. She connected her laptop to the house's wireless network, using a bridge she'd built to bypass the standard login screens. She would trace the signal back to its source, find out which server was receiving the footage, and then she'd have the proof she needed to show her father that Brenda was a parasite. Her fingers flew across the keys. The code flowed like water. She felt a grim sense of satisfaction as she bypassed the first layer of protection. It was almost too easy. She saw the data stream, a digital river of video and audio, flowing out of the house. She traced the destination, An IP address appeared, and her heart leaped. It was local. It was registered to a professional medical suite in downtown Greenwich. "I've got you," she whispered into her recorder. "Trace complete. Destination, 402 Mason Street." She felt a wave of relief. This was the smoking gun. Brenda was likely selling the footage to a tabloid or using it for blackmail. Sarah could take this to the police, or better yet, to her father's board of directors. She closed her laptop, a small, victorious smile playing on her lips. She had outsmarted them. She was safe. She walked to the window, looking down at the garden. She saw Jim counting the stairs of the terrace, and she felt a sudden urge to run down and tell him. She had the key card, and she had the source of the cameras. The nightmare was ending. She decided to check the address one last time to be sure. She typed the street number into a public directory. The result popped up, and the smile died on her face. 402 Mason Street wasn't a private investigator's office. It wasn't a blackmail ring. It was the office of Dr. Jonathan Thorne, her therapist. The room seemed to tilt. The very person she had spent the last 6 months pouring her heart out to, the man who knew her every fear, her every trigger, her every doubt about her own sanity, was the one watching her through the smoke detectors. The safe space of her therapy sessions hadn't been a sanctuary. It had been a laboratory. She realized with a sickening jolt that every word she'd spoken in that white, sterile office had been used to calibrate the traps in this house. Thorne wasn't just a doctor. He was a weapon designer, and she had given him the blueprints to her own mind. The key card in her pocket felt like a lead weight. She hadn't found a way out. She had simply discovered how deep the cage really went. The realization was interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic tapping at her door. Tap, tap, tap. "Sarah, dear, are you in there?" It was Brenda. The voice was melodic, practiced, and utterly devoid of warmth. Sarah shoved the laptop under her pillow and stood up, her legs feeling like water. She opened the door just a crack. Brenda stood there, her porcelain skin glowing in the hallway's dim light. She was wearing a dress the color of a bruised plum, her hair pinned back in a tight, severe bun. She smelled of midnight jasmine, that cloying, heavy scent that always seemed to linger long after she left a room. "I have some wonderful news," Brenda said, her smile never reaching her eyes. "We've decided to move the Midsummer Gala up to tonight. Your father thinks it's the perfect way to celebrate the merger and, well, your return to the family fold." "Tonight?" Sarah managed to say. "That's impossible. The catering, the guests, oh, it's all handled." Brenda interrupted, leaning in with a practiced intimacy that made Sarah want to recoil. She reached out and touched Sarah's shoulder, her fingers cold. "We want everyone to see you, Sarah, to see how much progress you've made. Dr. Thorne will be there, of course. He's so proud of you." Brenda leaned closer, and the smell of jasmine became suffocating. "Don't be late, dear. It would be such a shame if people thought you were having another episode." Brenda turned and walked away, and Sarah heard the faint sound of the guest bathroom faucet turning on. Splash, stop, splash, stop, splash, stop, the triple wash. Brenda was scrubbing the contagion of Sarah off her hands. Sarah stood in the doorway, the walls of the hallway pressing in. The clocks in the hall chimed, not in unison, but in a staggered, jarring sequence. She looked at her watch. It said 4 p.m. The grandfather clock in the foyer struck 5. She walked toward the stairs, her head spinning. On the landing, she saw a shattered bottle of her mother's favorite perfume. The glass glinted like diamonds against the dark carpet, and the scent of roses, her mother's scent, was being drowned out by the fresh, sharp smell of the jasmine Brenda had sprayed over it. The house was being rewritten. The time was being changed. Her memories were being painted over with eggshell white. Sarah knew she had to get to the basement. The key card she'd swiped from Harris, it had to be the way into the mainframe. If she could delete the recordings Thorne had collected, if she could wipe the data they were using to frame her as unstable, she might have a chance. She slipped down the back stairs, avoiding the main foyer where the caterers were already setting up long tables with wax fruit and silver platters. The air grew colder as she descended. The basement of the Greenwich estate was a labyrinth of exposed pipes and humming machinery. The temperature was kept at a constant, biting 55 degrees to protect the electronics. She found the server room behind a heavy steel door. She swiped the stolen card. The lock chirped, a high, digital bird call, and the door slid open. Inside, the blue light of the server racks turned her skin a sickly, ghostly gray. The fans whirred with a constant, dry throb that made her eyes sting. Sarah moved to the central terminal, her fingers numb from the chill. She jammed the card into the slot. The screen flickered to life. Access granted. She began navigating the file structure, searching for the folder marked with her name. She found it, gigabytes of video, audio logs, and behavioral analysis reports. Her finger hovered over the delete key. Suddenly, a red light began to pulse on the wall. It didn't make a sound, but the rhythmic flash was like a heartbeat. Silent alarm, she realized. The card? It was tracked. She tried to force the deletion, but the screen froze. A message appeared in the center of the monitor. Security intervention initiated. You really shouldn't be down here, Sarah. The voice came from the shadows behind the cooling units. A man stepped into the blue light. It was Michael Scott, Brenda's personal driver. He was a thick-necked man with a military buzz cut, and in his hand, he carried a heavy, rusted tire iron. He began to hum, a low, mournful funeral dirge that vibrated in the cramped space. Brenda said you might try something like this, Michael said, his eyes unblinking. She said you were restless. He lunged. The tire iron whistled through the air, narrowly missing Sarah's head as she dove behind a rack of cables. The metal bar struck a server casing with a shower of sparks and a scream of protesting machinery. The smell of scorched dust filled the air. Sarah scrambled backward, her hands catching on the cold metal of the racks. Michael moved with terrifying precision, his humming never faltering. He swung again, the iron bar catching Sarah's shoulder. Pain exploded through her arm, a dull, throbbing heat that made her vision swim. You're making a mess, Sarah, Michael whispered. And I'm the one who has to clean it up. He backed her into a corner, the humming growing louder, more insistent. Sarah looked up at the heavy bundles of server cables hanging from the ceiling like black vines. They were held in place by a series of tension releases. As Michael raised the tire iron for a final, crushing blow, Sarah reached up and yanked the emergency release lever on the wall. With a sound like a gunshot, the tension snapped. Hundreds of pounds of heavy, insulated cabling cascaded down, a black waterfall of plastic and copper. Michael disappeared beneath the heap, the tire iron clattering to the concrete floor. He let out a muffled grunt as the weight pinned him down, the cooling fans of the servers screaming as the cables were ripped from their sockets. Sarah didn't wait to see if he could get up. She grabbed her laptop and bolted for the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she ran past the fallen man, she saw his phone lying on the floor, the screen still glowing. Subverted. Sarah skidded to a halt. She needed to know who he was talking to. She snatched the phone, her thumb swiping across the screen. There was no passcode. The last message thread was open. She expected to see Brenda's name. She expected to see the cold, manipulative instructions of a stepmother trying to secure an inheritance. Instead, the name at the top of the screen was Robert Miller, her father. She scrolled up, her heart freezing in her chest. 1422. Robert, is she in the basement yet? 1423. Michael, just entered. Alarm is active. 1425. Robert, ensure she stays there until the transport arrives. The guests shouldn't see the struggle. Make it look like a breakdown. The phone slipped from her fingers. It wasn't Brenda. Brenda was just the tool, the shiny porcelain distraction. Her father, the man whose pride was his 47 identical white silk shirts. The man who measured his life in the purity of power, was the one directing the symphony. He wasn't being fooled. He was the conductor. He was framing her because she was a rounding error in his merger. She was a liability to the Miller brand, a piece of the past that reminded him of the woman he had liquidated. Sarah leaned against the cold concrete wall, the hum of the servers sounding like a mocking laugh. She had thought she was saving her father from a monster. She realized now that she was just a bug trying to save a spider from its own web. She heard heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway outside. More security. She shoved her feelings into a cold, dark place in her mind and ran. She didn't go for the stairs. She went for the service lift, the small, cramped elevator used for laundry. She emerged in the kitchen, her dress torn, her shoulder screaming in pain. The house was now a whirlwind of activity. The gala was beginning. In the ballroom, the crystal chandeliers flickered, sending thousands of rainbow prisms dancing across the walls. The air was thick with the smell of expensive perfume and the clinking of champagne flutes. Men in tuxedos and women in silk gowns moved like schools of fish, their voices a low, cultured murmur that drowned out the world outside. Brenda found her near the service entrance. She didn't look angry. She looked triumphant. She signaled to two maids who descended on Sarah like vultures. "Look at you," Brenda whispered, her eyes scanning Sarah's disheveled state. "You look exactly like she did at the end, frantic, dirty, unstable." "I know, Brenda," Sarah said, her voice a hollow shell. "I saw the texts. I know it's him." Brenda's smile widened, a predatory glint in her eyes. "Of course it's him, darling. Robert doesn't like loose ends. Now, let's get you into something appropriate. We have a show to start." Sarah was forced into a designer gown, a stiff, structured thing that felt like a cage of silk and boning. They did her hair, they painted her face, and then they paraded her into the ballroom. She felt like a specimen under a microscope. Every time she tried to speak to a guest, a member of the security team, David Harris or one of his clones, would step into her line of sight, their flashlight tapping against their thigh. Thud, 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 thud. She saw her father standing on the dais, his gold ring hitting his watch face in a steady metronome of impatience. Tap, tap, tap. He looked at her, and for a second, she saw the man who had gambled away his childhood home. There was no love there. Only the cold calculation of a man who had decided she was no longer worth the investment. In the foyer, Sarah saw a courier arriving. He was carrying a small padded envelope addressed to Brenda. Sarah knew this was it, the final report from Thorne, the evidence they would use to commit her. As the courier turned to speak to the receptionist, Sarah moved. She didn't run. She glided, using the crowd as a screen. She swiped the envelope from the courier's bag and slipped toward the garden doors. She needed Jim. She needed a witness. The garden was a labyrinth of shadows. The 10-foot hedges pressed inward, the air thick with the buzzing of cicadas. A wall of sound that felt like it was vibrating inside her skull. "Jim?" she whispered. "Jim, I have it. I have the drive." She reached the center of the maze, where the sundial stood with its reversed numerals. But Jim wasn't there. "He's busy, Sarah." Brenda stepped out from behind a hedge. She had discarded her socialite mask. Her face was a mask of cold, sharp angles. In her hand, she held a heavy silk scarf, the same bruised plum color as her dress. "Jim is counting the stairs in the basement," Brenda said, her voice a low hiss. "He's very good at staying out of the way when the weeds are being pulled." "You killed my mother," Sarah said, her hand tightening around the flash drive she'd taken from the envelope. "Your mother killed herself," Brenda replied, stepping closer. She was weak. She couldn't handle the red. She couldn't handle the truth of what Robert is. "But you? You're like him. You're a fighter. That's why you're so dangerous." Brenda lunged, the silk scarf flashing in the moonlight. She wrapped it around Sarah's throat, pulling tight. Sarah's world narrowed to the smell of jasmine and the sound of her own blood roaring in her ears. She clawed at the silk, her lungs screaming for air. Brenda's face was inches from hers, her cold, predatory eyes filled with a terrifying calm. "It's over, Sarah. The doctor has already signed the papers. You're going to a very quiet place where no one will ever hear your recordings again." Sarah felt her knees buckle. Her vision began to gray at the edges. But as she fell, her hand brushed against the sundial. The sharp stone edge bit into her palm. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Sarah drove her elbow into Brenda's ribs. The air left Brenda's lungs in a sharp wheeze, and the grip on the scarf slackened. Sarah didn't stop. She kicked out, her heel catching Brenda's shin, and scrambled away into the darkness of the hedges. She ran, the thorns tearing at her expensive gown, the cicadas screaming in her ears. She didn't go for the gate. She went for the house. She had the drive. She had the stage. She burst into the AV booth on the second floor, slamming the steel door and sliding the bolt. Outside, she could hear the heavy thud of security boots. "Open the door, Sarah." Her father's voice boomed through the wood. "Don't make this worse for yourself." Sarah didn't answer. She jammed the flash drive into the console. Her fingers flew across the sliders, overriding the ballroom's audio feed. She saw the crowd on the monitors below, the elite of Greenwich, waiting for the unstable daughter to be led away. "You want a show, Dad?" she whispered. "Here's the encore." She hit play. Subverted. Sarah leaned back, a sense of grim triumph washing over her. She had the drive from Thorne's office. It would be the raw footage of Brenda planting the pills. It would be the recording of Thorne admitting the conspiracy. The truth would finally be loud enough to drown out the lies. The speakers in the ballroom crackled to life. The music died. The guests looked up, their faces filled with curiosity. But it wasn't Brenda's voice that filled the room. It was Sarah's. I sometimes think I'm losing it." The voice sobbed, distorted and amplified, until it sounded like a demonic wail. "I see things. I see red everywhere. I want to hurt them. I want to burn it all down." Sarah froze. This wasn't the evidence. This was her own voice, from her most private sessions. But it had been chopped, rearranged, and layered with a dissonant, terrifying hum. "The record is incomplete," her voice whispered, sounding manic, obsessive. "I have to kill the decedent. I have to finish the sequence." On the monitors, She saw the guests recoil. Women covered their mouths. Men stepped back, their faces twisted in disgust and fear. "She's insane," someone shouted. Sarah frantically tried to stop the recording, but the console was locked. She had been baited. The envelope, the courier, it had all been a plant. They knew she would steal it. They had given her the very rope she was now using to hang herself. Her father appeared on the dais, his face a mask of tragic concern. He looked at the crowd, his voice amplified by a separate microphone. "As you can hear, my daughter is very ill. We have tried everything, but her obsession with the past has turned into a dangerous psychosis. Security, please. Take her to the transport. She needs help that we can no longer provide." Sarah slumped in the chair, the blue light of the monitors making her feel like a ghost. She had lost. She had played their game, and they had rewritten the rules while she was moving her pieces. The door to the AV booth groaned as a crowbar bit into the frame. Sarah sat in the dark of the holding room, the sound of a dripping faucet, plink, plink, drilling into her brain. The room was elegant, but it had no soft surfaces. It was a cage designed to be hosed down. She looked at her mother's watch on her wrist. It was a beautiful gold piece, but it had stopped years ago. Kindness remembers. Jim had told her once. She remembered her mother. She remembered the way her mother would pick at her cuticles until they bled, her eyes fixed on something Sarah couldn't see. Her mother hadn't been insane. She had been a prisoner, and she had left a message. Sarah pried the back off the watch with her fingernail. Inside, tucked behind the tiny, frozen gears, was a scrap of paper and a small silver battery. The paper wasn't a note. It was a series of numbers, a bypass code for the firm's master server. Her mother had known the red was coming, and she had hidden the key in the only place Robert would never look. The watch of the woman he had discarded. Sarah stood up. She didn't have much time. The ambulance, the medical transport, was idling in the driveway, its lights throwing rhythmic flashes of red and blue against the curtains. She took the small battery and the wires from the room's bedside lamp. She knew the electronic lock on the door was a fail-secure model. If she could short the circuit, the bolt would retract. It was a simple trick she'd learned in a summer internship, a physical metaphor for her life. Find the weak point and apply pressure. The spark was small, but the smell of ozone was unmistakable. The lock clicked. Sarah didn't run for the exit. She went back to the AV booth. She knew the security team would be looking for her at the perimeter. She slipped inside, the room still smelling of the scorched dust from her earlier attempt. She didn't use the flash drive this time. She used the code from the watch. She bypassed the Gala interface and went straight into the Miller Group's internal archives. She searched for Project Transition. There it was, a video file, timestamped the night of her mother's death. It wasn't a hidden camera. It was a recording from Robert's own executive suite security system. He was a man who recorded everything, a man who believed that data was power. Sarah hit broadcast. Every screen in the house, the monitors in the security room, the giant displays in the ballroom, the tablets in the guests' hands, flickered and changed. The image was clear. Robert and Brenda were standing in the very study where Sarah had fought Harris. They were looking at a glass of water on the desk. "Is it enough?" Brenda's voice was clear, devoid of its socialite lilt. "It's a therapeutic dose," Robert replied, his gold ring tapping on his watch. Tap, tap, tap. "The autopsy will show a heart stressed by years of instability. A tragic accident. The merger can proceed without her." Interference. He picked up the glass and handed it to Brenda. Make sure she drinks it all. I want the rotation to stay clean. The ballroom went silent. The dripping faucet in the holding room seemed to echo through the entire house. Sarah stood in the AV booth, watching the monitors. She saw her father's face drain of color. She saw Brenda reach for her throat, her porcelain mask finally shattered. The police, who had been standing by to escort Sarah to the asylum, moved with a different kind of purpose now. Handcuffs glinted in the light of the chandeliers. Sarah walked out of the booth and down the grand staircase. The guests parted for her like the Red Sea. She didn't look at the elite. She didn't look at the friends who had turned their backs. She stopped in front of her father. He was being led away, his white silk shirt rumpled, his $50,000 watch hanging loose on his wrist. The record is complete, Robert, Sarah said, her voice a low, steady whisper. Period. End of statement. She didn't wait for a response. She walked past him, past the jasmine and the bleach, and out into the cool night air. Jim was standing by the fountain. He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't count the stairs. He just nodded. The soil is clean now, Sarah, he said. It's not my soil, Jim, she replied. It never was. Sarah walked down the long gravel driveway. The sound of her footsteps was the only thing she heard. She reached the gate and kept walking, leaving the eggshell white houses and the lavender-scented mulch behind. She reached the bus station at the edge of town. The Welcome Home banner was torn, swaying in the wind of a passing coach. The smell of diesel fumes was thick and oily, a harsh, honest contrast to the sanitized world she had left. She sat on a wooden bench, the steady ticking of her mother's watch, now working, now alive. The only sound in the quiet night. She didn't have $1 billion. She didn't have a legacy. She had the truth. And for the first time in her life, the truth was enough. The bus pulled up, its air brakes screeching like a promise. Sarah stepped into the light, leaving the shadow of the Miller estate behind forever.